I'm here with Dr. Michael Hicks, an economist at Ball State University, and we are talking about the property tax reform bill that passed late last night and just minutes ago was signed into law by Governor Mike Braun. Dr. Hicks, why have so many Indiana property tax owners seen their bills go up over the past few years?
Yeah, great question. Sort of two parts to that. In the wake of COVID, we saw American households moving as a consequence of work from home opportunities. So even today, about 1 in 4 households with a college educated person in them are working from home as much as, you know, 12 out of every 15 days. So a week, and then maybe every 2 weeks you go to work one day. So that really enlarged the geography of where people could live. So people moved to good school corporations. They moved out of expensive apartments downtown. They moved to a small town, a long ways away from their work site because they only had to go in once a month. And that really increased the demand for housing in those nicer neighborhoods. In the wake of COVID, that drove up prices. At the same time, we weren't able to build homes because of labor shortages, social distancing, not enough workers coming in to do that. And then there's inflation. Inflation affects everything. And so in a dozen, maybe 14 Indiana counties, we saw really big property valuation growth. And that assessed value of homes followed the market value of homes and led to in some places pretty high increases in property tax, in other places modest increases, and in other places actual decreases over time. So there are some angry folks, some shocked folks, and some folks that were bitterly disappointed not to have higher valued homes like me.
So, this increase in property taxes that's happened over the past few years, are we seeing a crest of that? Is this sort of the end of that spike, or is it just too hard to tell?
No, I think for most places it's behind us. Our property taxes assess one year, so you pay the next year based on that year's valuation. So most people are now getting assessed values that are at or below their previous year's assessed values. For the assessment next year, as we move into recession, they'll probably be lower, and so that is really probably behind us. The system works in that way. Is reasonably well designed. We just didn't expect to have this much movement of people in such a short period, which I think contributed to the shock of this for some households.
So let's talk about this bill that Governor Braun just signed. There were many versions of it as it wound its way through the Indiana General Assembly. What does the bill that actually passed do?
So it does a ton of things that we could talk about it for an hour. There's some big ones. The first one is that it cuts property taxes for households. Somewhere the average family is going to save $200,000 to $300,000. So if you're in a $300,000 home, you should expect about a $300 cut. If you're in a $150,000 home, it'll be less than that because you're getting some exemptions already for having a mortgage or a homestead. And so the typical family, the median family, that person in the middle is going to get probably under $100 a year savings, and then the higher income families maybe $300. That's the first thing. The second thing it does is that it raises what's called the de minimis tax filing requirement on businesses. Before it used to be you didn't have to file property taxes as a business until you owned $80,000 worth of capital. And so $80,000 is probably that plumber's truck that comes to your home, or an electrician's truck, or a pretty small business that it's not worth them filing a property tax for. That threshold was raised to $1 million for next year and $2 million the year after that. So $1 million of capital, that's the majority of businesses in Indiana. That's almost every law firm. That's a lot of dental offices. That's a fast food restaurant. $2 million is a sit-down restaurant, maybe an orthopedic clinic. So it's a pretty big expansion of that. And then it did one other thing, that it eliminated the 30% floor on business personal property taxes that was invested after January 1st of this year. So it used to be that if you brought a $1 billion factory in, your taxes would drop through depreciation each year, and then they would, once they hit, after 8 years, they got down to only 30% value. You had to continue to pay your taxes on that 30% value through the life of that property. That's now gone. And so in towns that are manufacturing towns like Kokomo or Fort Wayne or Gary, Elkhart, Indianapolis, Terre Haute, Muncie, any of the big urban centers, or any rural place with big logistics facilities or factories, those places are about to lose a very substantial share of their property taxes on newly installed equipment. And so that's going to really change the tax revenue collections for property tax taxing units in those places.
So they gave a big tax break to those businesses that have those giant factories. And that's, as you said, those communities then are going to be missing out on that revenue that they had pretty consistently, right?
Yes, and then there's one that's a big problem for any place that's has big residual capital in it. That's a big wallop. The other thing that the de minimis does is that it because of the language, my interpretation of the language, which could be changed in a special session or down the road, normally what you do is you don't try to create taxing thresholds that people are afraid to hop over. So what you would do is eliminate personal property taxes on like the first $1 million of property, so it applies to everybody. And the reason for that is you don't want a small business to say, like, I only want to buy up to $1 million. If my property value hops over $1 million, now I have to pay property taxes on the whole thing, not just on the part that's over $1 million. So the language in here didn't really, it created this artificial threshold that is going to create a lot of bizarre business arrangements over the next couple of years in terms of what equipment they buy.
And so just to clarify, we're talking about the property that the business buys, not necessarily their property, the land, but the equipment, those kinds of things. And so because of this threshold, you might see businesses who would be less willing to invest beyond that and potentially grow so that they'd be able to hire more people, you'd have more jobs in the community. But because of this $1 million, that's going to impact the decision that those business owners make.
Right. So a successful restaurant that's maybe invested $900,000 in their property and they're doing really well, they're not going to add another room to their restaurant because that would kick them over the $1 million threshold. Or if you're going to your OBGYN, maybe they're not going to add an ultrasound machine because that would kick them over $1 million and they don't want to be paying taxes. So that sort of artificial tax threshold is the type of thing that a reasonable tax economist anywhere in the country would have warned the legislature off of doing, and this legislation contains that. So we're going to see a lot of gaming of the system for businesses to stay first next year under $1 million and the year after that under $2 million, and then we're going to see a lot of businesses happy to see their 30% threshold go away in the future.
So oftentimes when we hear about tax cuts, it's within sort of verbiage that says this is pro-growth, this is going to encourage growth. Is it fair to say that at least that provision of this law is potentially anti-growth?
Well, I actually think all elements are anti-growth. I think depending how you measure growth. So the cuts to personal income taxes that we homeowners pay is really going to fall heaviest on schools because they don't have any way to easily make up that revenue. We could talk about that in a minute. So that is going to reduce ultimately the value of some homes. It's going to make it difficult for kids to be transported to school. It's going to increase booster fees, all those sorts of things you do when you take away transportation and infrastructure funding from schools. So that's not pro-growth. The threshold limit on new businesses or businesses that are paying this de minimis tax, that prevents them from investing in if they're doing well, adding capital. And then for businesses that are seeing this threshold disappear, that's doing two things. One is that, it's incentivizing them to buy more capital, which will mostly be used to replace labor. That's what most capital investment in logistics and manufacturing does these days. So it's not going to add jobs, but what it will then do is turn around and be really deep cuts to municipal and school budgets, library budgets that is anti-growth. And so I think if you were to sum this up, it was intended to be pro-growth, but in actuality, there's almost nothing here that's going to stimulate either large business investment that would accommodate job growth. That's just not in this bill.
Yeah, maybe just a little refresher for those of us who don't know what property taxes go to pay for and what they don't.
Yeah, great. So we pay property taxes as households. We pay no more than 1% of the value of our home, the gross assessed value. So if you have a $300,000 home, you shouldn't be paying more than $3,000 for that. And then we get exemptions for it. I'm a disabled veteran. If I'm assumed to be over 65, we'll get cuts. And if you have a mortgage, you get a cut. And then businesses pay it on their business personal property, that equipment, the machinery, the trucks, the lathing machine, the CNC machine, that sort of stuff, and the value of their buildings. And that money goes to local government exclusively. About 42 cents on every dollar goes to schools, and they can only use it for two broad purposes. One is the maintenance and facilities of the school buildings, and the second one is transporting kids. And so that's what that money goes to. And then the remainder goes to firefighting services at townships or municipal governments. If you're a city, you have your own fire department. If you're not a city, if you're a town or a county area, you have townships that do that. They also pay for poor relief and the like. Taxes go to municipal governments to pay for police, protection, administration, parks, county governments for sheriff and jails. And then they go to library districts, to sanitary districts. There are many different special districts for ports, for airports, that sort of thing. And so, the biggest single slice is almost always to school corporations, because that's the big cost in local government. And the new legislation, it's a little bit ambiguous, takes away that any sort of offsetting capacity for local schools. So for them, it's essentially a loss. Some of the other districts have the ability to raise income taxes to offset their property tax losses.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because that seems like, the most interesting piece of the bill in terms of what's being discussed is the change in the ability for these local governments to sort of shoulder more of that tax burden.
Yeah, and that's a good thing. Most economists would say we want local fiscal flexibility. We want governments to be able to mix their type of taxation that best suits their economy. And so this new legislation, schools always had the authority to ask for two types of referendum of taxpayers. One for school operating funds so they could pay teachers better, and the other one for school building funds or transportation funding so that they could build a new school, build a new natatorium, refurbish their bus system if they needed it. And that's preserved in this. That hasn't been touched in this legislation. The new legislation says, well, now each local government can add to their local income tax. If you're a county, you can add 1.2% local income tax. If you're a municipal government, you can add 1.2 local income tax. If you're a public safety entity, which would mostly mean townships, you could budget another 0.4% of income taxes for public safety to include EMS services. And if you're any other local municipal government, you can have a 0.2 increase. And so that is viewed potentially, I view that as potentially meaning schools could do that, but it's not clear. That's a thing that courts are going to have to determine. The language was obtuse in SB 1. And then any other authority. So a school board, for example, could raise your income taxes. Your library board could raise your income taxes. Your sanitary district can now raise your income taxes. Your airport authority could raise your income taxes. So those things are now potentially on the table to offset. There's no restriction on how much they raise, but that could certainly offset or more than offset all the savings you got as a household from your property tax cuts.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, is how likely is it for Hoosier homeowners to actually see their taxes increase when you factor in these additional taxes relative to then what they would be saving on their property tax bill.
So in aggregate, if there had been no business tax cuts, and these are very large, in some places that's the vast majority of the long-term cuts are going to businesses. If it was just the household tax cuts, then I think the income tax on average would be about a wash with the tax cuts. The problem is you have households are primarily going to be paying these income taxes, although a limited liability company, that plumber or that small franchise will be paying income tax as well. In most of those places, their taxes are going to be more than offset by income tax increases because of the end of that 30% rule. Now, that won't hit for about 8 years, so it's in the distant future for us to get a good look at, but that represents such a large decrease in property taxes for some locations that you can see that all these income taxes are going to max out. So they're partially additive. So you could see a 1.8% increase in a county, 1.6 in a city, unless it has a library, so 1.8. So there's offsetting here that would be rather substantial. If you break it down more, if you say, well, let's not look at just the aggregate, all the income in a county, let's think about a family. So this is a big gift to the older households they're like on Social Security, or they're living on their retirement, their pensions. But they have a lot of wealth in their property. That's typically, we see older people are wealthier. They hold more from accruing over a lifetime, but their incomes are lower because they're retired. And then it shifts the tax burden from them to younger households who have less property and more income, so they're paying a higher burden. The other part of this is this doesn't really cut services that older people depend on. So this isn't really socking it to the police or the fire department or the EMS services, which are things that older households might consume at an above average rate, but it's really going to put the kibosh to funding for schools, which are an important contributor to the household production function of a young family. So a less economic way of saying that is, if I'm a family, I'm thinking about where I'm going, I want to go to a place that has good schools so I don't have to pay high cost to transport my kids to a private school. I want to go to a place that my home is going to increase in value that has good schools. So if you're pulling money out of schools, you're reducing the benefits that go to younger families. If you're cutting their property taxes but offsetting with higher income tax increases, you're not making them better off. So this is, even if it's a wash countywide, which it shouldn't be in a few years, this is really moving money from the wealthier families to the poorer families in the distribution of taxes in our state.
So going back to the business versus sort of the homeowners, is it fair to say that this is actually a law that's providing a lot more tax relief to businesses than it is to regular everyday Hoosiers?
Oh, in the long run, there's no doubt about it. So in the short run, the de minimis is $1 million. So that's most businesses, right? So if you're if you're a law firm, you may have owned your office, maybe it was $300,000, and you have some computers and you have some fancy desks, so you're paying property taxes on a lot of that, several $100,000 worth to run your business or a restaurant. Now you're not paying taxes on any of it. And so the real savings would offset the savings that 5 or 6 homeowners would get. And so most businesses are seeing their property tax costs zeroed out. The bigger businesses aren't seeing big benefits right now, but over the next several years, as their capital gets replaced and they don't have to pay taxes on that last 30%, they're getting a huge benefit through the depreciation schedule that businesses get. And that's going to really clobber any community that has given tax abatements or about to give tax abatements to a manufacturing company or a big logistics company or warehouse. Those places are going to get none of the tax benefits that they had expected when these places were installed. And I think that's going to be a real rude awakening to a lot of local governments that I expect legislators will hear about in the weeks to come.
So I think I know the answer to this question, but I want to ask it anyway. If you were serving as Mike Braun's economic advisor, Would you have advised him to sign this bill into law?
No, I would not have.
And tell me why that is.
Right. I wouldn't have done it because it didn't offer enough tax relief. I think that's the reason the lieutenant governor was urging him not to sign this. It didn't eliminate property taxes as he suggested. What I would have said is, look, Governor, you're in a really strong position. We have the seventh lowest property tax rate in the country. And so people who are angry about property taxes in Indiana are paying nearly the lowest across the country. And so if you want to do something for households, what you probably should consider doing is there a way we could reduce the sales tax rate? Could we spread that tax rate on more services? Instead of just goods, so that everybody was paying sales tax, not just people who are young and buying primarily homes and automobiles and consumer electronics and clothing. And that would reduce our rate from 34th in the country maybe to 20th. And in terms of income tax, we're right in the middle of the country on income tax. So we're doing pretty well on that. So I'm not sure. What I think would be a good message from the governor is that we've done a really good job in 2 decades of Republican rule in Indiana to secure a very low tax rate and a very good business environment in Indiana. What we maybe haven't done nearly as good a job at is funding schools and higher education in a way that would make us a destination for mobile, educated, affluent young families who are looking for a place to build a life and build wealth. That's what we ought to be focusing on.
Okay. Dr. Michael Hicks, thank you so much for your candor and your expertise.
Good to be with you again.